Let's do just a little bit of a brief review of what we talked about on Wednesday for those who may not have been here. Genesis 13, we have the separation of Abram and Lot. Both of their families have grown to such a point that the land can no longer sustain them. And I think it would help us to think about how large their flocks and herds had become if we think about what we read about in Genesis 14. So you remember when Lot moves his family towards Sodom. Thank you, Ben. And if you don't mind, I don't know the slide number. It's going to be toward the end, like 50 or something like that. Okay, thanks. So what happens to Lot in chapter 14? Not everybody at once. I can't hear whispers. It's a big room. All right, yeah, he's taken captive in this war of the kings, right? And so there are these 5 kings from the east, and they come to conquer these kings in the south. And Lot gets tangled up into that mess. And what does Abram do in response? He goes to rescue him. But do you remember that on Wednesday we read that Abram takes 318 trained fighting men from where? His own household. Okay, wow. Let's think about this for a minute. If Abram has 318 men in his household, and obviously we're not talking about his own children because he doesn't have any children at this point. We're talking about maybe extended family, like some other nephews or something like that, like Lot. We're talking about servants and the children of the servants. If there's 318 trained fighting men, you think there's probably some other men who are not yet trained, who are not of age, maybe children. You think there's some women. I mean, it says that all of these men were born in his house. So Abram has several hundred people who are in his company. How many sheep and goats and cattle do you think Abram has if he's going to take care of all those people? Okay. Abram is extremely wealthy, and he has a lot of people under his care. Now, Lot has also a very large numbers of possessions and things as well. So when you think about those numbers, then the story of Genesis 13, where Abram and Lot have to go their separate ways, becomes a little more understandable, right? These are very wealthy men. Now, just extrapolating based upon those numbers, you can see Abram is a man of immense wealth, considerable power, and as we said on Wednesday, Abram's a pretty bad dude. He's going to round up 318 soldiers, and they're going to go fight and defeat these kings. It's pretty impressive. You don't want to mess with Abram. And yet, at the same time, he's also apparently in the scripture, not apparently, he is depicted as this man of tremendous faith. And but some of you made the comment that on Wednesday, I just never really thought about that story, that Abraham was this fighting soldier type man. But apparently he was. Okay. Oh, thank you, Ben. A round of applause for Ben, who's no longer up here. Okay. Genesis 15, the covenant that God makes with Abram. We're going to talk a little bit more about the covenant in chapter 17, because that's the one that is the more substantial, perhaps, in our minds as we think about New Testament things especially. But in Genesis 15, God reaffirms the promise that he has made to Abram, that he's going to have descendants. In chapter 15 and in verse 1, God gives him this reassuring statement in a vision. And I don't really know what to make of this. I think this is interesting. The Lord comes to Abram in a vision and says, "Do not fear, Abram, I am a shield to you. Your reward shall be very great." I am a shield to you. Does Abram need this reassurance? Does he need God to tell him this? Is he discouraged for some reason? I don't really understand where this comes from. I do think it's interesting that Abram has just gone through this military campaign against these kings, and he's gone on the offensive, and he's been successful, and now God's next thing that he says to him is, I'm going to be your defense. I think that's kind of interesting. But when God makes this reassuring statement to him, Abram gets immediately to the point in verse 2 when he says, the heir in my house is Eliezer of Damascus. God, you've been promising me a child, and yet I am childless, and the heir that currently is in my house, of all the people in my house, my heir is not even my child. And so Abram says in verse 3, since you've given no offspring to me, one born in my house is my heir. But God is going to tell him, I haven't forgotten about the promise that I made. A great nation is going to come from you. Your descendants are going to inherit the land of Canaan. He'll say that to him again in just a moment. But God has not forgotten this promise that he has made to Abram, even though it seems that it's a little bit slow in developing in Abram's mind. Okay, I'm ready for this promise to come about. Now, in verse 4 and 5, God says, no, Eliezer will not be your heir. Verse 4, but one who will come forth from your own body, he shall be your heir. And he took him outside and said, now look to the heavens and count the stars if you are able to count them. So shall your descendants be. Already, several times since Genesis 12, God has said things to Abram that will remind him of the promise that God made back in Genesis 12. He will say things that reassure him, and it's as if God is saying, Abram, don't lose hope. I know what I told you long ago. I haven't forgotten about it. I need you to trust me. And Genesis 15 and verse 6 is a very important scripture. Abram believed in the Lord, and he, God, reckoned it to him, Abram, as righteousness. The significance of this passage becomes obvious when we get into the New Testament. And I'm not going to explore that right now. I want you to look at that in the Waldron book if you'd like to read some more about that. Brother Waldron has several comments to make there. But I want you to see the significance of this. This doesn't look like, this isn't a passage that just jumps out naturally off the page to us. But what is so significant about this passage? Abraham believed in the Lord. Why is that significant? Think about the chronology of Abram's life. God made this promise to him years ago. You're going to have descendants. A great nation is going to come from you. Okay, well, it's not happening yet. It's not happening yet. So God reassures. He says it again. He reminds him again. One from your own body will be the fulfillment of this promise. And so even when it didn't make sense to have hope in God's promise, Abram did. He believed in the Lord. It's a very powerful verse that teaches us something about Abram's faith. Now in verse 7, God comes to another promise that he has made, the land promise. In verse 7, he said, I am the Lord who brought you out of Ur of the Chaldeans to give you this land to possess it. Abram, you're going to have a child that comes from your body, and a great nation is going to come through you. And the land that you are in is the land that I'm going to give to them. It's another reminder of promises that God has made. Now in verse 8, Abram says, O Lord God, how may I know that I will possess it? I don't know if you struggled with this a little bit. I had to think through this some. I want you to jump forward in your mind to Luke's gospel, where there is a priest named Zacharias who is serving in the temple, and an angel visits him and says, "You're going to have a son." And Zacharias says, "How will I know that this is true? How will I know that this will come to pass?" On the surface, it looks like his question is very much the same as Abram's question in Genesis 15 and verse 8. How will I know that this is true? Now, what happened to Zacharias? He was stricken dumb and he was unable to speak until his son, John the Baptist, was born. Why doesn't God do something like that to Abram here? It seems that maybe Abram's question is of a different nature than what Zacharias said. Zacharias' question was coming more from a place of doubt. Whereas, remember, what did verse 6 just tell us? Abram believed in the Lord. So it seems that there must be something fundamentally different about the nature of Abram's question. Or else God, I think, perhaps could have responded in a different way. Christine?
Just really quick, remind us about how old was Abram in this situation?
Oh, I'm so glad you're going there. Okay. So we know for sure that he was 75 when he left Ur of the Chaldeans, right? I actually have this a little bit later in my notes because I was going to call attention to that on the slides. He's 75, and then we are told in chapter 16 and in verse 3 that when Ishmael, that whole process comes along, that it was 10 years later. Okay, so we're, 8, 9 years probably. So it's been a little bit of a long time coming, right, for this promise to come true. But, okay, Sandy?
One thing I think, because I'm trying to think of things as we go through this that you point out, like 56 graders, is that in Zechariah's case, he had the scriptures. He had, God had proved himself over and over and over and over.
Yeah, that's a good point.
We have the scriptures, so it's important to know them and to believe them, because Abraham was in a very different spot.
You mean Abraham couldn't pull out the Old Testament and read stories that, Moses would write 600 years from now? Yeah, that's a great point. Okay.
I think this is more of a question of when, not if.
Okay. Yeah, good observation. This is a question of when and not if. Okay. So I just, to make the point simple, I think there's something that is fundamentally different about Abram's question than Zacharias. You also see in the same chapter in Luke, an angel goes to Mary and makes this angelic announcement to her, and even she says, "How can this be?" But her question isn't coming from a lack of faith, it's coming from, "I'm not even married. How is, like practically speaking, how is this going to happen?" Right? So I just think it's interesting to see these responses that are given. Now, what we're going to have here in the next several verses is this covenant that is made between Abram and God, where there's a peek into an ancient process of covenant making between two parties. And Abram is told by God in verse 9 to bring him a 3-year-old heifer, a 3-year-old female goat, a 3-year-old ram, and a turtle dove, and a young pigeon. Do you think Abraham had any trouble rounding up those animals? Not anymore, right? I mean, now that you've thought about how many people are in his house and all the flocks and things, Abram probably could have rounded these up in 5 minutes. So he goes to get these animals, and it says that he takes the animals that are not the birds, and he cuts them in half, and he splits them. It says he did not do that to the birds, but these animals, the goat and the heifer, he splits them and he separates them. And apparently what they would do in the ancient world is the two parties, after cutting and dividing the animals, they would walk in between them. So you got half the animal over here and half on this side. They would walk in between it, in between the split animal. And that was a way of saying, we've come to terms here, and if one of us doesn't hold up our end of the deal, then may we turn into these animals. May the same be done to us, right? May we be cut and cut down, right? So this was just this formal kind of ceremony of covenant making in the ancient world, and God seems to utilize that here with Abraham. Obviously, God doesn't walk in between the two animals, but this is a divine verification of the earlier promises that God has made to Abram. Now, just to make the point even more clear, God's going to say something else about Abram's future descendants. Verse 13, God said to Abram, "Know for certain your descendants will be strangers in a land that is not theirs, where they will be enslaved and oppressed 400 years. What's that talking about? Yeah, when the Israelites are in the land of Egypt, when they're in bondage for 400 years. But, verse 14, I will judge the nation whom they served, that's Egypt. Afterward, they will come out with many possessions. That's exactly what happened. When the Israelites left the land of Egypt, you remember what the book of Exodus says the Egyptians were doing? Hey, here's all our stuff. Take it. Here's our gold and silver. Take it. Get out of here. Okay? We hate what you've done to us. God knew about this long before it happened. Then, verse 16, in the fourth generation, they, your descendants, will return here, the land of Canaan, for the iniquity of the Amorite is not yet complete. God is not only saying to Abram this generic, vague promise, you're going to have a child, you're going to have a child, you're going to have a child. In this chapter and in the next, he gives Abram very specific prophetic announcements about what's going to happen in the future of Abram's family. All right, let's roll into chapter 16. You guys got any questions about 15 before we move on? Yes, sir.
What are your thoughts about whether this is a dream or a vision or just a real event that occurred?
If it's a dream or a vision, how would it not still be a real event that occurred? I'm sorry, I'm not sure I understand. Oh, you mean the animal thing and the covenant part?
Did he really see the flame in the pot go off amongst the animals?
Okay, I see. I'm sorry. So there is question about that, and honestly, Dad, I didn't look into that too deeply to speak very definitely on that. I tend to think that it was an actual thing, but it does say clearly, chapter 15, verse 1, that it's a vision, and then later, verse 12, a deep sleep fell upon Abram. So if somebody was to say, well, I could see that this maybe did not happen literally, physically, but it happened in a vision or something, I don't know that I'd have any great qualms with that.
I've heard it explained the fire pot and the torch as symbolic of God himself passing among the animals. It's like, it's that God is here binding himself to the promise that he just made to the animal.
Yes, and also with it being a fire pot, God's presence is oftentimes symbolized by fire. So I've seen a lot of people who suggested that that's what the fire pot represented, that was the presence of God, the fire being the connection there. Okay, good. All right, chapter 16. So back to Christine's point. It's been 10 years since Abram left Ur of the Chaldees. You compare Genesis 12:4 and Genesis 16 and verse 3. So for 10 years, they've been waiting on this promise to be fulfilled, and it has not yet happened. So after 10 years of waiting, in chapter 16, then Sarai offers Hagar to Abram. Now, guys, little marriage advice. If your wife ever comes to you and says, hey, I have an idea. I got a friend, and you can marry her too. You can have her too. Listen, don't do it. It's a trick, okay? But in the ancient world, this was a pretty normal thing. If a woman is unable to have children, you guys know I'm kidding, right? I hope so. Okay, I know it's a little early for laughing. All right. In the ancient world, if a woman was unable to have children, oftentimes, if she was a woman of means, like Sarai was, this was something that they would have done quite naturally. This was an expected thing, perhaps. Offer up this maid, this concubine, and if she bears a child, then the husband, obviously in this case Abram, could choose to adopt that child and make the child his heir. And so this was a very normal thing. Now, where is Hagar from? She's from Egypt. How do you think she came to be in Abram and Sarai's service? They spent time in Egypt, right? Do you remember chapter 12? Look at verse 16. This is when Abram lied and said, tell them that you're my sister and not my wife, and that was discovered. But look at chapter 12 and verse 16. Therefore Pharaoh treated Abram well for her sake and gave him sheep and oxen and donkeys and male and female servants. So Hagar, the Egyptian, probably joins into Sarai's service when Pharaoh gives Abram a lot of stuff and treats him very kindly. Now, Abram agrees to this arrangement. Hagar becomes pregnant. But with that comes a great deal of strife and conflict. Sarai has, I'm sure, views of jealousy towards Hagar. Hagar has views towards Sarah that are creating conflict, and now something has to happen. So when Sarai brings this to Abram, he says in verse 6, your maid is in your power. Do to her what is good in your sight. She's your maid. This is your call. Can you see how difficult a position this was for Abram? He is stuck in the middle of these two women. His wife and now Hagar, who is pregnant with his child. And you can sense that Abram wants to do right by both of these women, but he doesn't really know what to do. How do you handle this scenario? So he says, Sarah, she's your servant. You do what you think is right. So what does Sarah do? She runs her off. Okay? So Hagar, it says that she flees from the presence of her, of Sarai. And it says that she goes down to Shur. Down here, this red box is kind of the general area of where she goes to. Where does it look like Hagar is going? Back home to Egypt. Yeah, she's headed back to Egypt. But while she is there, verse 7, the angel of the Lord found her by a spring of water in the wilderness, by the spring on the way to Shur. And he says to her, you need to go back home. You need to go back home to Abram, to Sarai. Return to your mistress, verse 9, and submit to her authority. Now, you think Hagar's excited about that? And yet, God makes great promises to her. In verse 10, he says that there's going to be a blessing for you in this. There's going to be a blessing to this child. The angel of the Lord said to her, I will greatly multiply your descendants so that they will be too many to count. And in verse 11, behold, you are with child, you will bear a son, and you shall call his name Ishmael, because the Lord has given heed to your affliction. He will be a wild donkey of a man. I said that to a woman in the hospital one time after her baby was born. I'm just kidding. I didn't actually do that. What an odd thing to say. But it does give some foreshadowing of the kind of relationship that Ishmael is going to have, his descendants. Verse 12 explains a little further. His hand will be against everyone, and everyone's hand will be against him. And he will live to the east of all his brothers. You say, man, that doesn't sound very good. No, it's not. But the descendants of Ishmael, throughout the biblical story, are going to be troubled with strife toward the descendants of Isaac. And you know what? It's still that way today. You're exactly right, Judy. It's still that way today. A lot of the trouble that we see in the Middle East, you can trace these nations back to Ishmael and to Isaac. There's a lot of trouble that exists. It's pretty remarkable, the things that God says here. Now, verse 13, she called the name of the Lord who spoke to her, "You are a God who sees." For she said, "Have I even remained alive here after seeing him?" This is interesting. She is to call her son's name Ishmael because God hears. And then she says to God, "You are the God who sees. You're the God who sees me. You're the God who hears me." And so Hagar listens to God's instructions. She goes back to Abram and to Sarai. And in verse 15, Hagar bore Abram a son, and Abram called the name of his son, whom Hagar bore, Ishmael. Abram was 86 years old when Hagar bore Ishmael to him. Okay. Anything about chapter 16 before we move on? All right. Chapter 17. The covenant of circumcision. Chapter 17, I want you to notice the break here. Verse 16 of chapter 16 says Abram was 86. Now 17 verse 1, when Abram was 99. So here we are 13 years later after Ishmael is born. Joe?
Saying in chapter 16, or 15 and 16, we tend to talk really harshly about them trying to come up with a way to fulfill the promise.
Right.
But he points out in the book how God did not, at this time, specifically indicate that Sarah was going to be the child's mother, just said it was going to come from Abram. So.
Yeah, that's a good point. All right. Abram is now 99, chapter 17, verse 1. Let me just throw this in as something for us to be reminded of. When you read in the book of Genesis, really throughout the Bible especially, but in the time of the patriarchs in particular, you read, God spoke to Abram. God spoke to Abram. God said this. God said this. And I think sometimes when you read the book of Genesis in quick succession, like we're doing, one chapter after another, you get the impression that Abram just woke up every day, made his coffee, and then walked outside and said, "Hey, God, how you doing today?" "I'm great. How are you? Here's what I want you to do today. I want you to go and, harvest the wheat." No. God spoke to very few people directly in the Bible. And when he did, most of the time, those speeches, those interactions were several years apart. Right here, it's 13 years between Genesis 16 and Genesis 17. God was not talking directly to people every day. I think sometimes we get that impression just because we read through the narratives so quickly. It was apparently 13 years between at least recorded discussions between Abram and God. Okay? So just to throw that in so that we don't get the wrong impression. But God speaks to him again, and he says, verse 2, chapter 17, "I will establish my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you exceedingly." Okay, here we go again, right? Yet another promise, and I'm going to have children, right? And so now we are 23, 24 years after the original promise of Genesis 12. And God changes his name from Abram to Abraham, which means father of a multitude. Okay, here we are, 24 years. You keep dangling that carrot out in front of me, right? God is not forgetting his promise. And he's saying to Abram, I need you to remember this. I haven't forgotten about this. I'm going to fulfill my words. Verse 6, "I will make you exceedingly fruitful. I will make nations of you. Kings will come forth from you." Wow. Okay. So all of these great promises that God continues to remind him of. Verse 8, he mentions the land promise again. "I will give to you and your descendants after you the land of your sojournings, all the land of Canaan." Great nation. this land. All of this is going to be yours. And so God enters into this covenant with Abram, and he says that as the sign of the covenant, the sign will be that of circumcision. So this sign is given as the way to identify those who are part of the descendants of Abram, who are the recipients of these promises of Abraham, and these are the ones who are in this covenant relationship with God. Now, there's a lot that the rest of the Scripture, particularly the New Testament, has to say about this. And the particulars of the circumcision covenant are given in verses 10 through 14. God says, this is how you do this. On the 8th day, all the males will be circumcised throughout your generations. Any servant who is born in your house, and so forth. Then in verse 14, if someone does not receive this, then it says he will be cut off from his people, for he has broken my covenant. So God changes Abram's name to Abraham, then gives him the sign of the covenant of circumcision. Then he changes Sarai's name to Sarah, which means princess or noble woman. And how old is Sarah at this point, by the way? Verse 17 tells us that she is 90 years old. So Abraham is 99, Sarah is 90. Now Abraham, I'm so glad we're here now, because now I can stop saying Abram. I can just say Abraham the rest of the way. That's what I've been wanting to say all along. Abraham asks God, verse 18, "Oh, that Ishmael might live before you." Can Ishmael be the child through whom your promises are fulfilled? Now, I mentioned in chapter 15 that God made a very precise prediction and a prophecy about Abram's descendants. They will serve another nation 400 years, and then after that, they'll come out and come live in this land. Now, God gives another very specific proclamation. He says, verse 19, "No, Sarah your wife will bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him for an everlasting covenant for his descendants after him." No, I'm not just saying you're going to have a son. Sarah's going to have a son, and Abraham, I want you to call him Isaac. Give him this name. Gives him very specific instructions. My covenant, verse 21, I will establish with Isaac, whom Sarah will bear to you at this time next year. Okay, does God have plans for this family? Yes. Very specific plans for this family. No, Ishmael is not the one through whom the promises will come. It is Isaac through whom these promises will be fulfilled. So then, chapter 17, verses 23 through 27, you have all of the males, listen to this, all the males in Abraham's house receiving the covenant of circumcision. You think that took, 5-6 minutes to do? How long did this take? Well, we know that there were at least 318 fighting trained men who were in his house, who were born in his house, and surely there were many more than that. This took a long time. What'd you say, Jimmy?
Could you imagine being the one that had to tell everybody what was about to happen?
You do kind of wonder, it's like, could there not be another sign for the covenant? Could we do something else, right? But Abraham takes this very seriously, and he says, okay, I'm going to do this. Ishmael's going to do this. And all the men in my house are going to do this. And any future males that are given in this house are going to do this as well. That was a major undertaking. And there was much wailing in Israel, I'm sure. Okay, so we're through chapter 17. You guys got any questions or comments that you want to make about where we've been? Jerry?
On the Esdras, I studied numbers in the scriptures and meaning, and God had that H. H is the eighth letter of the
I've never heard that. I don't doubt you. I've never heard that, though. That's interesting.
He calls the covenant everlasting in verse 7.
Yes.
Would Abraham understand that as eternal? You know, Paul will refer to the promise that God made to him being unconditional. Like, in what sense is this something that's stuck with the land thing and the people thing?
Right. Good question. Okay, so I remember I remember reading about this. I don't remember where. If it was in the Waldron book, maybe it was just in a commentary. I don't remember. The term that's used for everlasting, in our minds, everlasting means everlasting, eternal, right? And that word that's used can mean that. But apparently it can also mean what we would say is, well, this is going to last until something else comes along that all parties would agree, makes a distinction or changes this, right? So you and I might say, we could have used that word in a personal, say, a business arrangement, with the understanding that once you and I are no longer business partners, or once we're dead, well, this doesn't apply anymore. There's other circumstances that can affect it. So apparently it's a pretty diverse word. But even if that's not the case, there are times in Scripture when God says this is eternal, but then God is the one who later says, well, I'm making a change to that. And of course, He has the right to do that. Okay, good thoughts. Thanks, everybody. A dispensation, yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, okay, good thought.